Mr. President.
The Senator from California.
Mr. President, I rise today to bring before the Senate a resolution concerning one of our most serious constitutional responsibilities, whether the United States should engage in armed conflict against a particular adversary. The Constitution clearly and intentionally places the power to declare war in the hands of this body, the Congress, not with the President or the executive branch. Our Constitution's framers, having just endured a war and having paid the toll that war always takes, wanted to ensure that our newly independent nation would see the representatives of the people make the decision whether and when to put American lives on the line. In 1798, James Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson about the danger of leaving that power in the hands of an executive. He said, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it, having accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." For the past month, Congress's power to authorize or refuse to authorize the use of power has been usurped by the executive. This administration has carried out at least 4 military strikes against vessels that it asserts have ties to drug trafficking organizations. These strikes were not authorized by Congress. Congress has not been shown the evidence of who exactly was on board these ships, whether they were all headed to the United States or some other destination, or whether they posed an imminent danger of attack on the United States. Such strikes are not legal, and they are not made legal or constitutional by the claim, correctly or incorrectly, with or without evidence, that some or all of the occupants of these boats belong to a list of organizations kept secret by the administration. Being put on a list by the executive branch does not deprive Congress of its vital role in approving the use of force. But such a list, kept hidden from the American people, if used as a justification, may drag our nation into an unintended war. If it were as simple for a president, any president, to claim that war power for himself by placing an individual or a group of individuals on a list, let alone one held in secret, there would be no limiting principle to the executive's use of force, no limits whatsoever, and that is deeply inconsistent with the intent of our framers and the desire of the American people to be kept out of unnecessary military conflicts. Indeed, the President has confirmed that he does not see a limit. He saw targets at sea, and now he sees potential targets on land. Now, I know that the word unprecedented gets used so much these days that perhaps it's lost some of its value. But we need to put in context just how far from normal these strikes are. For perhaps the first time in our history, a president of the United States ordered the U.S. military to use lethal force against individuals who posed no imminent threat of attack and who could have been stopped thousands of miles from our shore had we interdicted and arrested those on board, just as they routinely are by our Coast Guard. Instead, the U.S. military used lethal force on 4 separate occasions, killing everyone on board. And despite this breathtaking departure from more than 2 centuries of law and practice, we still know almost nothing about these strikes, some taking place as far as 2,700 miles away. It may be there were narcotics traffickers on board some or all of these vessels. It may also be that some of these boats were being used for human trafficking, and the victims of that offense were killed along with the perpetrators. Or if not on one of the first 4 ships destroyed, then perhaps on the next one. The lack of detail concerning these strikes is telling. We have learned of these strikes through social media posts from the President, the Secretary of Defense, and from the press. In fact, administration officials have offered differing accounts of where these vessels were heading. Media reports have suggested, without rebuttal from the administration, that the first vessel to be struck had turned around prior to being hit. The Secretary of State originally claimed that one of the boats wasn't even heading to the United States. Given our Coast Guard presence in the region with a sizable Navy deployment and expansive intelligence resources, U.S. personnel could have boarded all of these vessels, detained those on board, seized any drugs or cash, and gathered additional information about ties to drug trafficking organizations, just as they normally do. Secretary of State Rubio even acknowledged publicly that this could have been done, but said that the president wanted to send a message by killing all those on board. Now, we all agree that the scourge of drugs is real and that scores of Americans die from such poison every year. We are all committed on both sides of the aisle to battling the importation of illegal drugs, even as we work to beat back addiction here at home. But we are also committed to our Constitution, to a system of checks and balances that wisely place the power to make war in our hands, not an executive that may grow too fond of using it. That is why Senator Kaine and I have introduced a resolution to direct the president to stop engaging in armed strikes against these vessels or the country from which they emanate without the explicit authorization of Congress. And we are here today to ask our colleagues to join us in this nonpartisan vote, in this affirmation of Congress's authority to declare war or to refuse to declare it, to authorize force or to refuse to authorize it. We have been precise and deliberate with crafting it. This resolution does not affect the United States' ability to target terrorist groups covered by Congress's existing authorizations to use military force, including al-Qaeda, ISIS, or its affiliates and offshoots, or address real threats posed by other groups like the Houthis. It also in no way limits the United States' ability to defend our own citizens and interests or to come to the collective defense, self-defense of our allies and our partners. It comes down to this. The president has used our military to strike unknown targets on at least 4 occasions, and he is promising more. With at least 21 people dead and more killing on the way, with the president telling us that strikes on land-based targets may be next, we ask you to join us and reassert Congress's vital control over the war power. And with that, Mr. President, I yield.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in support of Senators Schiff and Kaine's resolution regarding war powers. This resolution would just say very simply that if the Trump administration wants to be at war against a terrorist organization, they should come to Congress, notify us, and seek our approval. Currently, the administration is waging a secret war against a secret list of unnamed groups that they will not tell us about. There's been 4 lethal strikes against boats in the Caribbean. The administration wrote this body a letter about what they were doing in September. They said they consider themselves to be in, quote, a non-international armed conflict. That means a war against a secret list of, quote, designated terrorist organizations. I received a briefing last week on the administration's strikes in the Caribbean. During that briefing, members of the Senate Armed Services Committee from both sides of the aisle asked a Senate-confirmed official whether the Department of Defense could produce a list of the organizations that are now considered terrorists by the United States. They said they could not provide that list. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a CIA officer. I'm a former Pentagon official. I did 3 tours in Iraq armed alongside the military. I participated in targeting of terrorist groups. And I actually have no real problem going against cartels, given what they have done in inserting drugs in our community, the death of so many Americans. But as a nation, I think we should have as a basic principle that you can't have a secret list of terrorist organizations that the American public and certainly the U.S. Congress don't get to even know the names of. The problem for me is that this is unprecedented. You know, during the global war on terror, which is kind of my era, it was very clear. Terrorist organizations would be notified. If we wanted to declare a new terrorist organization, it would be notified to Congress. And then our intelligence community, the military, law enforcement would spin up to go after information about that group and prosecute, targeting against that group. But that is not what's going on today. And we will not understand the apparently dozens of terrorist organizations that we have now named until we understand their names. Now, this is important in the foreign context, right? This is unprecedented in terms of what we've done against foreign adversaries, foreign terrorist organizations. But what I want to draw people's attention to is the implication for what is happening inside our own country. In September, also last month, the Trump administration put out a new executive order about domestic terrorist organizations. They said that they were going to, again, make secret lists of terrorist groups inside the United States and send the full force of the U.S. government against those terrorist organizations. They are not telling anyone the name of these organizations, but they are authorizing law enforcement and the intelligence community to double down and come up with that list. This is a problem because the Trump administration defined in that document a terrorist organization or domestic terrorism incredibly broadly. It suggests that any group that talks about anti-Christian values, views they don't like on migration or race, differing views on the role of the family, religion, or morality could all be grounds for labeling an organization domestic terrorists. If this administration is not telling us who's on their secret designated terrorist list for groups in the Caribbean, they're definitely not going to tell us who's on their list of domestic terrorist organizations. We saw, to start us off, the Attorney General down in Texas put out publicly that he is now going to launch a campaign against domestic terrorist organizations in his own state. So it has begun. Meanwhile, we know what's going on in some of our American cities. Trump said that he would invoke potentially the Insurrection Act of 1807. He has made more than 800 of our military generals fly in from across the world and talk about going after the enemy from within, his words, and making American towns and cities their training grounds for the military. This is important, and I think every American should understand what it means if the President of the United States follows through with what he said and says that he's now invoking the Insurrection Act. That means certain city, the violence has gotten to a level of an insurrection, and it means that the U.S. military can now be used as law enforcement in our cities. It means the U.S. military can raid, they can arrest, they can detain. You can easily see a world where the President of the United States labels protest groups terrorists, doesn't tell anyone, creates an excuse to unilaterally use the military inside our cities, similar to the way he's used them in the Caribbean. And just to be clear, this is straight out of an authoritarian playbook, right? Where the president gets to play judge, jury, and executioner. This time, instead of stopping drug traffickers, it will be stopping Americans, potentially from exercising their right to freedom of speech. This is not theoretical, using the U.S. military in our streets. This is not something that the president hasn't already thought about. We know that in the first Trump administration, the president called up his Secretary of Defense, his chairman of the Joint Chiefs, because he was upset about protests that were going on in front of the White House. Mark Esper was the Secretary of Defense. He wrote about this in his book called A Sacred Oath, and he talked about some of the things that President Trump asked him to do. Trump wanted him to send in not the National Guard, but the 82nd Airborne, an active duty military unit, one of our most elite, large units, to quell protests here in Washington, D.C. He asked for them to be moved into the city, and when the back and forth happened with former Secretary Esper, President Trump asked him point blank, "Can't you just shoot them in the legs or something?" I want to just flag for everybody that we are seeing a repeat of that story, but in exponentially more gruesome detail play out right now. The president is looking for an excuse to send in the U.S. military into our streets, to deploy the U.S. military against his own people, to prompt confrontation, and to hope that that confrontation justifies even more military force and military control. This is a well-worn authoritarian playbook. It's one that quite literally the United States of America was founded on rejecting. The idea that the British soldiers, when they occupied American cities, abused American citizens to the point where Americans turned against them. I'm a former CIA officer, a former Pentagon official. I've worked alongside the military my entire life. I cannot stomach the idea that the American people would fear the uniformed military that have given their lives to protect them for so many years. But all of us in this chamber, and certainly those of us who have served in the past, swore an oath to the Constitution, not to a king, not to a party, not to any one person. Nobody gets to rewrite the Constitution, not a president, not an advisor, no one. If the president wants to use force abroad or at home, he needs to come to this body and explain it publicly to the American public. Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
The senator from Arkansas.
Incredibly, the Democrats are here to condemn President Trump's recent strikes against narco terrorists operating in our backyard. Maybe they want to distract from the Schumer shutdown by tying the president's hands and siding with narco terrorists who have the blood of hundreds of thousands of Americans on their hands. Whatever the reason, this would be foolhardy. If you think I'm exaggerating here, let me remind you of the kind of depraved savages we're dealing with. Recall the Trinidad gang member who tried to rape 22-year-old Laken Riley while she was out for a jog on a college campus. After Laken fought back, this savage smashed her head with a rock and strangled her to death. Also recall the two Trinidad gang members who, after being released into our country by Joe Biden, raped and murdered 12-year-old Jocelyn Nungare. These animals threw this innocent little girl's body off a bridge. Finally, consider the recent arrest of the Trinidad gang leader who kidnapped 3 women and shot them in the back of the head in an alley in Chicago. Only one survived to call for help. These are the sort of horrific acts of violence that narco-terrorists commit against Americans. And of course, these narco-terrorists, many affiliated with Trinidad, also flood our country with dangerous drugs that have taken the lives of tens of thousands of Americans every year, after year, after year. They target every state in our union with their poison. This is among the many reasons why President Trump was well within his constitutional authority to take action against these narco-terrorists that put American lives at risk. These recent strikes fulfilled President Trump's constitutional duty to protect Americans as their elected commander-in-chief. And this should come as no surprise. President Trump stated very clearly and repeatedly during the campaign that he would attack these cartels if necessary. This is simply him keeping his word to the American people. Also, the president's strikes were lawfully sound and extremely limited. Because they've been going on for less than 60 days, they don't even fall within the War Powers Resolution threshold. I would also note that presidential action like this is hardly unheard of or unique. For context, as of the mid-20th century, scholars identified more than 100 military deployments or actions that lacked express prior congressional authorization. I could go back to the beginning of the Republic with the Barbary pirates off the coast of North Africa. But there's another example, much closer in time, and, for that matter, on the border. That would be President George H.W. Bush's decision to invade and topple the government of Panama in 1989 without prior congressional approval. He ordered 12,000 American troops into that country. We toppled Panama's illegitimate regime, we apprehended the country's dictator, and he spent the rest of his life in foreign custody. Now, let's compare these two cases. In both cases, you have the leader of a country that is indicted by the United States courts for drug trafficking. In both cases, that leader is not recognized by the United States government as the legitimate leader of his country. I'd say the comparison ends there because the case is much stronger here than it was in 1989. Maduro also has, I think, a $50 million reward on his head from our government. Maduro is associated with a designated foreign terrorist organization. Noriega didn't have a reward. Noriega wasn't associated with a designated foreign terrorist organization. Maduro is in league with China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. Noriega was not. Yet, George Bush invaded Panama and overthrew its government. I don't hear many Democrats in retrospect saying that this was an unwise action or made our country less safe. And somehow Donald Trump is doing those things merely by striking a few boats of drug traffickers in international waters. Now, even if you had misgivings about these strikes, even maybe if you were a Democrat in Congress in 1989, as some of our colleagues were, and you condemned President Bush for taking action to defend our country, I would still point out that the resolution before us is overbroad. The resolution prevents the President from taking offensive action against any foreign terrorist organization designated on or after February 20th of this year. This includes the Iranian-backed Houthi terrorists in Yemen. It appears our Democratic friends have forgotten that the Houthis are responsible for at least 150 attacks against the United States and allied naval and commercial ships, which have killed at least 3 people. These terrorists have also targeted our friends in Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, mostly civilians for that matter. So if the Democrats had their way, President Trump would not be able to, for example, strike a secret meeting of senior Houthi leaders. Wouldn't be able to strike imminent attacks on our friends in countries like Israel, Saudi Arabia, or United Arab Emirates. I think we should all agree that we want our president, when terrorists are gathered together for the purpose of planning attacks against American civilians, our troops, or our friends abroad, to have the authority necessary to take action. Now, the Democrats claim, oh, there's a carve-out in our resolution. Oh, we have a saving clause. We have a rule of construction that says our troops can defend themselves. Once again, they're misleading the American people. I invite you to read it closely. It may allow our sailors to defend themselves if these Houthi terrorists shoot a missile or a drone directly at their ship, but it absolutely ties the president's hands if, for instance, we have intelligence about a senior meeting of Houthi terrorist leaders. It absolutely ties the president's hands from protecting our friends in places like Jerusalem and Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. There's no question about that. It's the black letter of the resolution. It only goes for about 3 lines. I'd invite anyone to read it, and you'll understand that the Democrats are once again dissembling. No reasonable person denies the authority of the president to strike a terrorist threat on foreign soil. Yet the Democrats are here tonight questioning the president's authority to do the exact same thing in our own backyard, in international waters, no less, not even foreign territory. This is a dangerous double standard. Therefore, Mr. President, I encourage my colleagues to vote no on this resolution and to get back to the more pressing business of reopening our government. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President, let me take this
Senator
opportunity.
from California.
Thank you. Let me take this opportunity to address some of the remarks of my colleague, who has, I think, rightly pointed out the horrors of drug trafficking and those that are engaged in that poisonous, deadly trade. I agree with that. We should do everything we can to fight back against those who are trying to traffic that poison into this country. But here's the thing, and I agree with him about the murderous dictator that is Maduro. But here's the thing. If my colleagues in this Congress want to go to war with Venezuela, if they want to use military force to bring about regime change in Venezuela, or if they want to wage a literal war using the military and armed force to blow up traffickers, then they need to come to Congress and seek an authorization to use military force for that purpose, because our Constitution is clear. There are essentially three circumstances in which we can constitutionally use force. One is if the Congress declares war. We have not declared war on Venezuela. We have not declared a literal fighting war using military troops either. Or we authorize the use of military force. We have not done so. Now, the third circumstance in which a president is authorized to use force is in the event of imminent threat of attack from our adversaries. And that is simply not the circumstance here. Instead, what the administration seems to be relying on is a claim that it has the power somehow to put organizations on a list and go after them wherever they may be without the approval of Congress. That's what this resolution is about. Now, my colleague also made an argument about the Houthis. Nothing in this resolution affects the ability to defend ourselves from the Houthis as necessary. The president and the former presidents who have taken action against the Houthis have not done so on the basis of the Houthis being added to some list. Being added to a list, even a foreign terrorist organization list, empowers an administration to put sanctions on that organization, but being placed on a list by the executive does not give any greater authority to use armed force against an organization. The basis in which this president and previous presidents have used force against the Houthis is the Houthis have attacked us. And if the Houthis attack us again, the president will have the Article 2 power to defend ourselves. And nothing in this resolution touches that in any way, shape, or form. But let me just underscore the perils of what we're discussing today. Now, this is an article that just came out. I don't have the chance to vet it. Colombian president claims U.S. bombed Colombian boat in strike off Venezuela. So I don't know whether we have now struck a Colombian ship or what the circumstances were or who was on board, and that's exactly the problem. That's exactly the problem. Now, maybe this is real and maybe it isn't. But the fact that we don't know, the fact that the executive asserts the authority to blow up ships without coming to Congress for the authorization of that kind of force could invariably lead to mistakes, could also lead inadvertently to war with another country. This resolution says, you want to use force against narco terrorists by blowing up ships, come to Congress for an authorization, because at this point you don't have it. If there's an imminent threat of attack, you have all the authority you need under Article 2. But if you want to engage in a war with Venezuela or regime change with Maduro and you want to use military force to do it, you need to come to Congress for an authorization. There being none, these strikes are unconstitutional and unlawful, and I would urge my colleagues to join Senator Kaine and myself in supporting this resolution. I yield, Mr. President.
The senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, we're here today to talk about a resolution put forth by the Democrats that is very, very not well taken. We're all aware in this body that on September 4th, President Trump notified Congress of his initial strike against narco terrorists who were bringing deadly and illegal drugs into this country, the first of 4 such strikes. Now, my colleague just referred to the fact that the president can, if there's an imminent attack on our country, that they can strike. This wasn't an imminent attack. This was an actual attack. It was in progress. It was going on. People were attacking our country by bringing in poisonous substances to deposit into our country that would have killed Americans all over America, including your constituents. Fortunately, most of those drugs are now at the bottom of the ocean. Had that not happened, I guarantee you there would have been hundreds, maybe thousands of people in this country that would have been killed with the tremendous amount of drugs that were being brought in. The facts of that are obviously well-known, well-reported, and if you want to see more, certainly available in the Intelligence Committee. The people carrying those drugs were terrorists, plain and simple. They were trafficking drugs that finance a designated foreign terrorist organization. These strikes were fully compliant and fully justified under the President's Article 2 constitutional authority, and not only authority, but duty as Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces to defend this country. And he took an oath to do so. So why are we here today? We're looking at a resolution saying that he can't do this anymore. This is nonsense. It is unreasonable. It's why the American people look at Congress and say, are you people crazy? You got the President of the United States trying to do something about this terrible scourge that's going on in America, and you in Congress are saying, don't be doing that anymore unless you come here and ask us for permission to do it. So, these actions are political, pure and simple. These actions here are political. This was a good decision on the part of the President, and the President acted legally. So, what are my Democrat friends doing here? They're putting forth this joint resolution number 83 to stop the President from acting in the way he has just acted to stop these drugs from coming into the country. So let's look at what it says. Let's look at the actual language. Congress hereby directs the President of the United States to terminate the use of the United States Armed Forces for hostilities against any organization designated on or after February 20th, 2025, his date of inauguration, as a foreign terrorist organization or specifically designated global terrorist, any state, any states in which these entities operate, or any non-state organizations engaged in the promotion, trafficking, and distribution of illegal drugs. You're telling the President to stop using this against organizations and people who are trafficking drugs and for distribution and on the way to the United States. And it goes on to say that he can't do this unless explicitly authorized by a declaration of war or specific authorization for use of military force by this organization. How long do you think it would take him to get that? Those drugs not only would have been delivered to the United States, they would have not only been distributed in the United States, there would be dead Americans, and we'd still be here yakking about it. So, even if this passed, and it's not going to, but if it did pass, he's not going to obey this order. He can't obey this order. He took an oath to defend this country. When he sees an attack like this coming, an attack of drugs or explosives or anything else that's going to kill Americans, he not only has the authority to do something about it, he has the duty to do something about it. We should have a resolution out here not condemning what he did and telling him, don't do this anymore. We should have a resolution out here thanking him for the hundreds, probably thousands of lives that he saved with these 4 attacks, including constituents in your districts. Thank you, Mr. President, for what you did. Thank you, and continue the good work of taking these drugs out of the traffic and putting them on the bottom of the ocean. My friends, this is Trump derangement syndrome. These people hate President Trump. I get that. But simply because you hate him, you should not wallow in that hate like you have and produce this kind of a product that stops the president from doing what he is supposed to do. This is shameful, and it should be defeated, and it's going to be defeated. Thank you, Mr. President.
President.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, my colleague from Idaho's emotional speech notwithstanding, this is not about hating a president. It's about loving a Constitution. It's about loving a Constitution. The resolution that my colleague, Senator Schiff, has filed, which I gladly co-sponsor, does not say there cannot be military action against terrorists or cartels or drug traffickers. It just says that the United States should not be at war without a vote of Congress. The United States should not be at war against groups on a secret list prepared by one individual who is unwilling to share it with Congress and with the American public. My colleague said that we should put a resolution on the floor thanking the president. I have an idea for my Republican colleagues. Put a resolution on the floor declaring war against narco traffickers. Why haven't they done that? That's what the Constitution says they should do. They are so strong in their belief that we should be at war with narco traffickers. Why haven't they put a resolution before this body to say we should be at war with cartels and narco traffickers? There are 2 reasons. They know it would fail, even in a Republican Senate. And second, they're afraid to vote on that resolution because they know their constituents are tired of wars and don't want Congress declaring more wars and treating serious law enforcement problems as challenges for the United States military. I strongly support the resolution that my colleague has filed. When President Trump announced in August that he might undertake this action, Senator Schiff and I conferred with other senators, and when the first strike was taken on the 4th of September, we wrote a letter to the president as the Article I branch charged with the power of declaring war, asking him a basic series of questions. Give us the evidence that these boats were actually carrying narcotics. Give us the legal rationale for striking them without coming to Congress. If you knew where they were enough to strike them, you could have interdicted them. Why did you choose to strike them and not interdict them? We hear that drugs are now at the bottom of the sea. If you interdict a ship and you seize drugs, you get evidence, you get individuals that you interrogate, and you build cases against the higher-ups in the narco trafficking ring. When you destroy a boat, you don't get the evidence. You can't build the case. And we asked, why not interdict? Why strike rather than interdict? These were questions that Congress has a right to know the answer, and the American public has to know the right to answer. And we asked the president, give us answers to these questions in 7 days. Not unreasonable. We have yet to get answers to these questions. The administration believes it does not have to justify these actions to Congress. It does not have to tell us the evidence about the narcotics content of these boats. It does not have to give us a clear legal rationale. It does not have to explain the decision to strike rather than to interdict. When you ask basic questions and you're not given answers, you get suspicious that the answers are not forthcoming because there aren't good answers to the questions that we asked. We did have a follow-up hearing, the Armed Services Committee in the secure facility last week, and I can't really talk about what was said there, but I can sure talk about what wasn't said there. No answer to the question of why not interdict? It was asked over and over and over again. And aside from asserting we have the ability to do what we did, they could not provide an answer about interdiction. They could not provide clear evidence that all of those boats actually had narcotics on them, even though they knew we would be asking that question. And so the legal rationale, all they said was the president has an Article II ability to undertake these actions. Saying I can do whatever I want under Article II is not an answer, and that's no legal rationale, but it's essentially what the president is saying. I can put groups on a list, and we understand it's many groups and their affiliates, and not tell Congress and not tell the American public, and I get to make the decision about whether the nation goes to war. That's not what our Constitution says. My colleague, Senator Schiff, has talked about the Constitution, so I won't belabor it, but there is a couple of points that I do want to stress, because there is nothing more important in the Constitution than the power to declare war. The founders who wrote the Constitution in 1787 debated this topic extensively, and they recognized a reality. In the world at the time, decisions about war were made by the executive, king, monarch, emperor, czar, pope. It was made by the executive. The framers of the Constitution in 1787 were dealing with leadership that included the first president of the United States, George Washington, the greatest general that's ever been president of the United States. They revered George Washington. But when they had to make a decision about who declared war, they said, even George Washington is not smart enough to carry that sole decision on his shoulders to make war. And so they decided to do something almost completely contrary to the whole flow of human history, and they invested the power to declare war in the legislative branch, in Congress. And my colleague read Madison's exchange as the principal drafter of the provision with Jefferson many years later about why they had done it. They wanted with studied care to vest the question of war in the legislative branch. It's not only in the Constitution, it's in the Constitution for a reason. And here's the reason. A decision about war puts troops in harm's way, puts troops in a position where they may be injured or killed. They may see their best friends injured or killed. They could come home with physical injuries or mental injuries that could affect the remainder of their lives. The Constitution of the United States, in a somewhat unique way, requires congressional approval for war so that there is a consensus of the nation after a full debate in view of the American public and a vote that the war is in the national interest. If a president goes off unilaterally without getting Congress on board, then we're asking people to risk their lives with no national consensus that the mission is worth it. Could there be a grosser example of public immorality than to order troops into harm's way where they could be killed and their lives and their families affected for the rest of their lives without a national consensus that this is a mission worth you risking your life? That's why that provision is so sacred in the Article I branch, and that's why even George Washington was not entrusted by the framers of the Constitution to make a decision like this on his own. I will finish where I started. This is not about dissatisfaction with President Trump. I filed similar resolutions, as my colleague from Idaho knows, when President Obama was president. I came into the Senate in 2013 with an absolute obsession because of the military nature of my state, because one of my kids is a Marine, with an absolute obsession that the nation should never go to war, never, without a debate in Congress that the American people can see, can learn from, and a political consensus that the war is worth it. Yes, there is an exception for defense from imminent attack. That's been understood as part of the presidential power of commander-in-chief since the very first days of this republic. But even in that instance, it was always foreseen that Congress would come in and have a debate and agree or not with whether they blessed the mission or not. Letting a single individual take us to war based on a secret list that he won't even reveal to the public or to Congress sets such a dangerous precedent. And if my colleagues, as they've stated, believe we should be at war in the Caribbean or at war with nations in the Americas over the narco traffickers, they've had the ability the entire time to bring a resolution before us and have that debate in front of the American public. And I have a feeling that debate would produce some positive votes if it were limited enough. But to allow a president to do it by secret without Congress having the guts to have the debate and vote about whether the war is worthwhile is contrary to everything this country stands for and to the oath we take. I would urge folks to support my colleague's resolution.